American Horror Story Freak Show is over 9 years old now, and I spent the last couple of weeks going back and watching it. This season of the show is definitely an interesting one in the entirety of American Horror Story, because some call it the beginning of the end of when the show was good, as it's perceived as being the last season that had what American Horror Story should have at its core, which is a very cool concept. But at the same time, it was the first time where cracks were truly showing with the drawn-out nature of the story. After searching about this season after watching it, I was surprised to see that there wasn't that much coverage of it, so I thought I'd provide a full breakdown and a review on American Horror Story Freak Show. So let's get into it. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. So the first episode in this season did a good job at establishing the characters' motives, intentions, and introducing us to the world, which was 1952 Jupiter, when many strange things were occurring. We started by seeing Bette Dot, two individuals who were Siamese twins who were responsible for the murder of their mother and one's attempted murder of the other, ultimately leading them to being in hospital and viewed as a monster in society. We saw Twisty the Clown was wreaking havoc on residents in Jupiter, with either killing them or kidnapping them and taking them to his bus in the middle of the woods where he'd hold them hostage. Plus, there was also Elsa's Cabinet of Curiosities in the town, where it was full of a group of people which would traditionally make up the cast of a freak show. Your small people, tall people, pinheads and bearded lady, etc. Elsa Mars was the first true character that we were introduced to in the show, and we saw the exploitative nature that she had and that she'd essentially put an individual through anything if it meant that she had a chance of becoming a star. Something which was at the center of this character's arc throughout the entirety of the show. The cast in the sideshow viewed her as their mother, so it made it even worse when she'd exploit them or not have their best interests at heart. Her freak show was something which was dying and was in decline. When looking back at history, it's said that in the 1920s, freak shows in circuses were on the decline, and attendance at them had started dwindling. However, some managed to survive until after the Second World War, which would be a prime example of Elsa Mars's, and why it was on its last legs in 1952. What was interesting about Elsa was that she was an individual that made out that she had such sympathy for the cast in her show, and she called them her monsters due to the fact that they appeared different to other folk in society, but she herself didn't actually have any legs. She had them cut off against her will as part of a black film market and was left to suffer. Due to what happened to her legs, she was so insecure about being considered a monster and was worried that it would ruin her chances of being a star, so she didn't even tell the people that she was closest with that she didn't have any legs, as she never truly wanted to be on their level. She wanted to be superior, which says a lot about the mindset and the mentality that Elsa Mars had. She only ever revealed it to a select few later on in the show when everything was going against her. Her relationship with Bette and Maud was a relationship where I feel we saw the core of Elsa Mars and who she truly was as a person. She was the realist with them. There was no kidding these two, and she knew it. Her role would switch with them from this motherly instinct that she'd give to the rest of the cast, but then she'd sell them off to Dandy in the blink of an eye and go back to viewing them as her property. She was almost threatened by them at points, which is something that I did find interesting. She wanted to be the star of the show and didn't want to inform anybody of her disability in fear of being viewed as a monster, but in reality, it was the monsters that were filling the seats and were getting the round of applause after every show. So seeing her battle to become the person who she felt she was destined to become, whilst keeping her true self hidden, was a particularly interesting arc, because there were genuine points where I felt like she cared about her monsters. The love that she had for Pepper was something that I do feel was genuine though. The fact that Elsa wanted Pepper to go to what she believed was a good home, and took her from the orphanage when she was younger and made an effort to keep her happy throughout her life, showed that there was an ounce of care there. I think Elsa did view her almost like her own child, and her true motherly instincts were coming out at that point. The fact that she was even emotional when she left Pepper with her sister, it showed that there was an ounce of care that was within her. During the final episode, with Elsa, when we saw that she had made it to the top, we saw that the life that she thought that the golden age of Hollywood would bring her was something that didn't live up to its expectation. She almost mourned the life that she used to have at the freak show, so much so that upon her death, when she was finally taken by Edward Mordrake after performing on Halloween, her heaven was her back at her show and performing on stage with everybody around her to a full crowd every night, surrounded by the people that she did actually care about. so I guess Elsa did care about them in her weird, funny way. Now let's move on to Bette Dot's story. After Elsa, these two were the next main characters that we saw being developed, and they almost acted as us in the early parts of the show, as they were the outsiders in the sideshow as they arrived there late and weren't part of the core cast in the performances. Bette and Dot were Siamese twins, and it's said that they were most likely inspired by Daisy and Violet Hilton, twins that were born in Brighton, England in the early 1900s. Daisy and Violet toured around the world in sideshows, and it was in true fashion where their controllers kept all of the money that they would have earned, basically showing that they were exploited. Dot was the sister which had the more dominant role and personality out of the two, and was more reserved and less prone to being taken advantage of, whereas Bette, she was an individual who was relatively soft-spoken and naive when being around others. She craved fame and wanted to be a star, whereas on the other hand, or head, I guess, Dot wanted to be free from being restricted by being one with her sister, hence why her whole narrative was focused around trying to save up enough money in order to get surgery to free herself from her sister, even if it meant that one of them would die. They soon became the stars of the Cabinet of Curiosity show, and it piqued interest with local rich boy Dandy Mott, a character that I'm really looking forward to talking about shortly. Bette was infatuated with Dandy and enjoyed the attention that he gave her and the lifestyle that she'd lead if they were to be a romantic couple. However, Dot wasn't for it in the slightest, and with her being the dominant twin, her word went, so they ended up abandoning their chance of living a life of riches in order to go back to the family at the Freak Show. Their narrative also kind of supported the home and family that they all found together, whilst being ostracized by society and viewed as a monster. When inside of the tent and around people that were also on the harsh end of the same treatment, there was solace and comfort there. We almost saw them grow more and more as the season developed, and they gained more independence and confidence. For example, when they hustled Elsa into giving them a split of ticket sales in order for them to stay silent about her selling them off to Dandy, and also when they got closer with Chester and they had their first intimate experience with somebody. Something which I believed gave them the confidence to be with Jimmy Darling at the end, and own who they were, which meant that they could cement a place in society, on a road that was filled with people that weren't like them whilst not being fearful of it, something which they were in the very first episode. What started with a look of fear ended with a smile and happiness. Now let's look at a core part of the show which made up the first few episodes and I thought would have lasted a bit longer. This is Twisty the Clown. Twisty the Clown was menacing. He was fearful to look at, he was big, he had a creepy half-clown mask and had no emotion at all behind the eyes. He was brutal in his attacks and he almost didn't care who or what his victims were. Taking small children or young women, it meant nothing to him. Twisty to me is true American Horror Story. He was just horror in general, a frightening sight that would make you feel extremely uncomfortable if you saw him anywhere. Most of his scenes were about him just going on murderous rampages. That was until Dandy's mother bought Twisty when at the side of the road in order to be an entertainer for her son. However, when they were together, we saw that Dandy and Twisty were a lot more similar than one would expect. So much so that when Dandy followed Twisty into the woods after Twisty left Dandy's property, when Twisty's victims escaped, Dandy brought them right back and showed that he was pretty much happy to get involved. One of the best things about Twisty was the level of backstory that we got to him as the season went on. We saw that once upon a time he was a clown that purely loved entertaining people, and was originally also part of a freak show. However, he was bullied out of the show, and upon feeling as though he was an outcast, he tried to end things for himself but was unsuccessful in doing so. Hence why the whole bottom half of his face was exposed and he wore a mask to keep it covered up. He was acting on pain and only ever wanted to entertain people, but it was him being ostracized which drove him to the point of murder. Twisty's narrative marked the polar opposite to what everybody in Elsa's show was like and how they acted. If he was in Elsa's show instead of the one that he was bullied out of, he probably wouldn't have ended up going down that path. But because he was, he actually acted in a way that society viewed the cast of the shows as an actual monster. So it was a really interesting way of positioning a character that could have had a different outcome, if only the decisions that were made along the way were different for him. Twisty the Clown was ultimately taken by Edward as the victim on the night of Halloween following the performance. It was a place where it seemed as though he found solitude and comfort, and was out of the pain which he viewed living life as. Now let's talk about probably the most interesting character in the show, Dandy. Dandy was definitely one of my favourite characters, just because of the journey that we went on with him. That scene where he was walking through the Freak Show grounds after buying it and wiping all of them out was just brutal and showed how much of a heartless individual he was. Dandy was the boy of a rich family, and he was obsessed with Dot, Bette, and the others that were in the Freak Show. Despite being in his 20s, he was an individual that would throw tantrums if things didn't go his way, and he would act like he was a baby. He was a true mama's boy, and it was clear to see that he was spoiled his whole life. As the season developed, we saw that the tantrums that he had and the fact that he felt different ultimately started developing into this burning rage that he had for others, and the belief that he was put on the earth to claim lives, stating that that was the reason as to why he was there. He was inspired by Twisty the Clown after meeting him, and went on to use his mask when carrying out the brutal massacres that he committed. What was interesting about Dandy was the fact that he wanted to be part of the Freak Show at the start because he felt different, but because he didn't have any kind of physical difference, they didn't allow him to join. But what Dandy did have was some kind of mental condition. Genetic breeding in the family in order to preserve the wealth and keep it in-house meant that Dandy didn't have any physical differences, but his mind was impacted. This was another arm of the show that I thought was quite interesting. Just like with Twisty, it showed somebody who was different, perceived to be different, but on a different pathway to the main characters. Dandy's descent into madness was something which I took joy in watching, as he became horrific and far more terrifying than Twisty ever was. This was solely because of the unpredictable nature that he had. You didn't know if he was going to kill you or let you go. The intense emotions that were on his face, the screaming, whining, and tears that would be going down him provided a performance that I thought was just utterly petrifying, and one of the best in the season. I knew when he was on screen I was going to be uncomfortable. With Dandy eventually going on to acquire the Cabinet of Curiosity show from Elsa following Chester being arrested for the killing of Maggie, and also his wife and her lover, we saw that because there was 0 tickets sold on his first night, he turned on the stars of the show, and ultimately, with them returning the aggression and refusing to work for him, he lost their respect. This didn't sit well with Dandy, due to his chaotic personality and the fact that he didn't like being told no to anything. Just like how a child thinks, he went on to brutally murder everybody in the show in the most horrific fashion, killing them where they stood. The scene was horrific to watch, and it was a bloodbath, with him being tricked by Dot and Bette into marrying him and making him believe that they were happy together. The one thing that he always wanted. In actual fact, they were working with Jimmy and Desiree, who discovered the bodies, and they ultimately poisoned him so he passed out and woke up inside of a tank, which was part of Houdini's great escape trick. In this instance, the four of them sat down and watched the water slowly fill up until he couldn't escape, and the evil individual that was Dandy was no more. His kill count in this series was so incredibly high, and he was a real evil individual. But despite being evil to his core, he was one of the best, most interesting characters in the show. Even though his story wasn't necessarily a main focus to begin with, and we'd only ever get drip-fed him doing a killing and pieces of his slow descent into darkness, it ended up being one of the main events that unfolded, and that was something that I liked, as it tied into the main narrative and provided a good sense of resolution. Never would I have predicted that ending and the massacre that he committed, but it made an incredible finale for sure. Whilst we're partway through this video, I just want to say if you're enjoying it, then feel free to hit subscribe, and also comment down below which American Horror story you want to see a full breakdown of next. Now let's move on to Jimmy Darling and the stories that he was caught up in. Jimmy Darling was caught up in a few different stories. He was the people's person in the Freak Show, and he stood up for all of those that were around him. Even when it came to the likes of Meep being arrested and brutally killed, he felt the weight of Meep's death due to being the individual that killed the officer that Meep got framed for killing, and it never sat right with him. He also felt the weight of the views that society had, and he wanted to fight back at every occasion possible. This was until the likes of Maggie came along and softened him up, and also Dot and Bette. Jimmy was Ethel's son, which everybody knew, and he was also Del's son, but this wasn't public knowledge at the start. I felt like Jimmy's main inclusion in the show was standing up for those that were around him and owning the fact that he was different. What he originally viewed as a curse, he ultimately ended up viewing as his own identity, and he didn't want that to change, seeing as though the wooden hands that he got made for him in the end ended up mimicking how his hands used to look. The grifters Maggie and Stanley, who were looking to acquire the individuals in the show and display them in a museum, impacted him in different ways. For example, Maggie was romantically entangled with him, but they ultimately ended up splitting up, and Stanley ended up lying to him and saying that he'd get Jimmy a good lawyer. This was so that he could get out of jail for the slaughtering that he didn't commit, but Dandy did, if he allowed him to have his claws, which were his hands, something which he was scammed out of as Stanley never followed through with that. It was his father who ultimately came through in the end with others from the show who ended up getting him rescued from the prison van. Jimmy's relationship with his mother and father was something that was really enjoyable to watch. He was a mama's boy for sure, but not in the way that Dandy was, and we saw that upon her death it quite literally tore him apart, and it was some of the more emotional moments in the season. You could see that he got his softness from his mother, and the level of care that he had for others from her too, as Ethel was the true mother to the group, whilst Elsa was just looking to exploit them all. The relationship that he had with his father was something that was non-existent until the later parts of the season. Del was on the cusp of actually killing his son, so that he could give Stanley Jimmy's hands, as he was being blackmailed and threatened with the fact that he'd be outed as being gay if he didn't do it, but he chose not to, and from that moment on they had an existing relationship. However, with Del being the individual that was responsible for killing Ma Petite and giving her to Stanley to display in the museum, it meant that he faced the wrath of Elsa as she killed him on the spot, meaning that Jimmy had nobody left in terms of blood family. I mentioned everything else before that kind of followed about him killing Dandy and discovering everybody, but his arc ultimately ended with him being with Bette Dot, two individuals that he was initially attracted to before Maggie came along, and they were also pregnant with his child. So the love that he learned to have from his mother and the protection that he felt towards the family that he once had was something which he'd be passing over to his own child, an ending for the character that I felt was right. With regards to Stanley and Maggie, their grifting storyline of pretending to be a Hollywood agent to Elsa and promising her the fame that she always wanted, and Maggie pretending to be a fortune teller came to an end when Maggie eventually changed sides and sympathized with the cast that she grew close to. With them all finding out about what Stanley was up to, we saw that he was attacked from all angles and was turned into the very thing that he tried to display, a monster, and one would presume that he eventually went on to die there. With Maggie, her death came as a slight surprise, because at that point, basically the whole cast being killed was something that I just didn't expect to happen, but I did kind of feel bad for her death. She changed her ways, found love with Jimmy, and learned to live amongst those at the show. However, she suffered a horrific death at the hands of Chester. Chester had a tainted mind where he believed that his puppet was actually real. In losing Dot and Bet as his assistants, Maggie agreed to get inside of the box for the saw in half trick, and with Chester hallucinating and seeing his wife that he killed and her lover, he didn't do the trick correctly and ended up sawing her in half. It was a scene that was brutal to look at for sure. The final main story that I'm going to touch on from the season before I give my review of it is what made up a lot of episode 10 of the show. This was Pepper and her placement with her sister and the sad end that she faced. Something which I feel, I don't know if it was deliberately done to highlight this, but I felt it was done to shine a light on the fact that people that have some kind of mental barrier or communication barrier can be exploited by the wrong type of people if they're placed in their care. With Elsa going away and following the death of Pepper's husband Salty, we saw that Elsa placed Pepper in the care of her sister who abandoned her many years ago. However, with us finding out about Pepper's sister's horrific side, things took a dark turn for Pepper. Pepper's sister fell pregnant and her child went on to exhibit characteristics that made them look different to most folk in society, and it ultimately led her and her husband to go on to kill their child. Following them doing that, they placed the blame on Pepper, meaning that Pepper was essentially locked up for life at an institution where she'd most likely never be able to go free. She couldn't deny it because she didn't have the mental capacity or communication skills to be able to get it across. Whilst the ending was horrific for Pepper, it looked like there was actually somebody that finally cared for her and was looking out for her, with the nuns saying that she'd try and reform Pepper. It was a very small feature in the show, but it was one that I got a deeper meaning from with the story that was portrayed and told to us. So what did I think of this season of the show? Well, I really enjoyed watching this season of the show and the many different arms to the story that it had. I thought all of the characters were interesting and there was a clear three-part structure to the story that was being told to us. I would say though that I do agree with most when it comes to this season, and also bear in mind that they're about an hour apiece too, so it's not like a normal show, and I would say that it did start to lose itself slightly the longer that it went on. However, it did manage to recover at the end, which is what goes in its favour massively. Each and every one of these characters was written so well, and they were performed so convincingly that it was a pleasure to be able to watch them. The world that was created was something that I felt was also really convincing, and it felt established and like I was genuinely transported back to the 1950s. Despite there being a massacre and it being a horrible ending for the characters in their world, with the ending focusing on it basically being a character that you play, and post-death you're who you truly are and your dreams are lived out, it provided a happy ending where all of the characters were at peace and were in their happy place. Plus, with Jimmy, Bette and Dot being together and finding their place in society, that was something that also provided a nice end for them. The final moment being Elsa stood on stage about to perform the song that she was booed off in the early part of the show, but us not hearing a word was such a powerful way for it to end, and I'm glad that they chose to do that. Elsa's motto was always leave them wanting more, and she truly did that with us with this ending. I think this is a great season of American Horror Story, and despite there being some cracks within it, it had some iconic characters, some great storytelling, and some of the best performances in the show. For that, this season shall be remembered.